Imagine living in a prison. Not just stone walls, but a psychological one, built from betrayal, paranoia, and the constant threat of death. You're a child, watching your family vanish, one by one. Now imagine that one day they hand you the keys to the entire world, to the greatest empire on earth. What do? Do you free everyone? Or do you turn the world into your own, twisted version of that prison? This isn't just history. This is Caligula, a boy forged in a living hell who then used the mightiest empire on earth as his personal laboratory for pain. His rule wasn't about power. It was about control. The ultimate, terrifying experiment on human dignity. Before we go any further, be warned. This isn't just history. This is a chilling dive into the depths of a human mind that will give you goosebumps and make you question everything you thought you knew about power and about humanity itself. You'll wonder, how could someone like this ever exist? Ready for the show? Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. That's the chilling question that hangs in the air after Caligula's reign. How could someone like him ever exist? To even begin to understand, we have to peel back the layers of imperial Rome and look, not at its glory, but at the breeding ground of its darkest monster. Caligula wasn't born into sunshine and imperial glory. No, he was born into the heart of a nightmare. His full name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but history knows him as Caligula Little Boot, a seemingly affectionate nickname given by the soldiers he once marched with. A cute name for a child who would grow into terror. This seemingly innocent start was a cruel irony. His family, revered heroes like Germanicus, were systematically erased by the paranoid emperor Tiberius. Imagine being a child, barely a teenager, watching your mother, your brothers, slowly, brutally disappear. Not in some distant war, but from within your own palace walls. This wasn't just loss. It was a masterclass in betrayal and terror, a cold, hard lesson in the ultimate vulnerability of life, even at the very top of the food chain. Every whispered secret, every forced disappearance, every chilling silence became a brick in the mental prison he inhabited. And where did this traumatized boy end up after the echoes of his family's screams faded? On the island of Capri, Tiberius's private fortress. Forget images of serene Mediterranean beauty. Capri, under Tiberius, was less a palace and more a human laboratory. Think less of a dignified royal court and more of a twisted cult compound, a place of unspeakable orgies, dark rituals, and the chilling screams of those unfortunate enough to displease the emperor. Tiberius wasn't just a ruler, he was Caligula's twisted mentor, a living textbook on depravity. He didn't just show Caligula cruelty, he groomed him. He taught Caligula not how to govern, but how to dominate through fear, how to read terror in a man's eyes, how to exploit every human weakness, and perhaps most disturbingly, how to derive sick pleasure from watching it all unfold. For years, Caligula was a silent, absorbing pupil in the emperor's theater of torment. So, here's the chilling thought, a universal question that transcends time. If your childhood was a living hell, crafted by paranoia and sadism, would you emerge determined to build a heaven, to break the cycle? Or would you simply build another hell, one where you finally held all the power, finally able to inflict the same kind of pain that molded you? Caligula's story isn't just about a single mad emperor. It's about a terrifying examination of how unchecked power, in a culture that deified its leaders and offered no real checks or balances, can transform deep psychological wounds into instruments of mass torment. The answer in Rome's darkest hour was a resounding, blood-soaked yes. Yet, when the news of Tiberius's death finally broke, a strange calm descended upon Rome. The nightmare seemed to be over, and the boy who had survived the shadows was about to step into the light, wearing a mask of mercy so convincing it fooled an entire empire. If you think this is just a dusty old history lesson, about a mad emperor who lived 2,000 years ago. Think again. You need to understand the dark origins of this monster, because Caligula never truly died. He just changes masks, waiting for the next stage to be set. Keep watching, because this story isn't just about ancient Rome. It's about the shadows that still linger today. With Tiberius's death, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. The old emperor's reign had been a suffocating blanket of paranoia and cruelty, leaving a city starved for hope. Now, finally, a new dawn. And who better to usher it in than Caligula, the lost prince, the last remaining scion of a revered family, the survivor of Tiberius's brutal purges. The streets erupted in cheers. Legions saluted. Every Roman, from the senators to the common citizens, believed the nightmare was truly over. And at first, he delivered. Caligula, the boy who had witnessed every betrayal, every act of cold-blooded terror, stepped onto the public stage not as a tyrant in waiting, but as a benevolent savior. He immediately pardoned countless political prisoners, men and women who had suffered under Tiberius, their return a powerful symbol of a new era. He slashed the oppressive tax burdens that had crippled the common people, instantly winning their adoration. He showered the military with lavish bonuses, securing their unwavering loyalty. Beyond practical reforms, he understood the Roman thirst for spectacle and ritual. He held magnificent, tearful funerals for his murdered family members, positioning himself as the grieving son and brother, a masterstroke that solidified public sympathy. The temples were filled with new offerings, new prayers for the divine young emperor, now hailed as the very embodiment of hope. It was a perfect performance of rebirth and redemption, but genuine mercy was never in his nature. How could it be, forged in the fires of Capri, a child's mind warped by witnessing unchecked sadism? This wasn't compassion. This was calculation. A chillingly brilliant opening act from a man who learned the dark art of control from the master himself, Tiberius. He understood the desperate hope of the Roman people, their craving for a hero after years of terror. He knew exactly what they wanted to see, what they needed to believe. In a society that revered power and embraced public spectacle as a form of governance, Caligula was simply building a grand, magnificent stage. A dazzling illusion designed to charm, to disarm, to lull everyone into a false sense of security. This wasn't the reign of a merciful leader. This was the meticulously crafted setup for the ultimate fall. Every pardon, every bonus, every tear shed for his family, every cheer from the crowd was simply tightening the chains, making the eventual betrayal all the more devastating. The mask of mercy was firmly in place, shimmering brightly under the Roman sun. But how long could it possibly last before the creature beneath began to stir, ready to unleash the true horror it had learned to wield? The honeymoon period, that brief, deceptive calm, couldn't last. The mask of mercy didn't just slip. It began to shatter, piece by terrifying piece, revealing the true face of the monster Caligula had become. The boy who survived hell on Capri wasn't building a new Rome. He was building a twisted reflection of his own nightmares and dragging everyone into it. The first truly chilling sign. He began to declare himself a god. Not as a mere title, a polite formality for a Roman emperor, but as an absolute, tangible reality. He didn't just demand statues in temples. He demanded to be worshipped directly, often dressing as various deities. Jupiter, Apollo, even Venus, forcing senators, high officials, and even foreign dignitaries to prostrate themselves before him in bizarre, humiliating rituals. To disbelieve, to hesitate, was an act of treason that often meant death. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a profound, terrifying break from reality, a psychological descent where absolute power met a fragile, damaged ego and became a delusion. The palace, once a symbol of imperial authority, began transforming into a grotesque theater of blood, sex, and unhinged madness. Public decency evaporated. Private life became a brutal, public spectacle orchestrated by Caligula's whims. He flaunted his incestuous relationships with his own sisters, turning taboo into grotesque entertainment. He murdered family members and powerful figures on mere suspicion, or simply for perverse amusement. But it wasn't just death that he craved. It was humiliation, degradation, the utter shattering of the human spirit. Senators, once revered pillars of Rome, were forced to run for miles in front of his chariot, enduring agonizing public degradation, or were made to wait on him like common slaves. He'd invite them to lavish feasts, only to randomly burst into insane laughter, eyes darting from face to face, leaving everyone to wonder whose life was about to end. Or worse, he'd have one of them quietly dragged away mid-meal, their empty seat a chilling reminder of total power. The boy who once survived by making himself silent and invisible in Tiberius's reign of terror now used that same silence, that terrifying unpredictability, to inflict unimaginable fear, ensuring that everyone around him was utterly silenced, physically or psychologically. His power wasn't just over their lives, it was over their very dignity, their sanity. The curtain had finally fallen on the merciful prince. What remained was a terrifying spectacle, an emperor unchained, his madness infecting every corner of Rome. He was no longer just experimenting on individuals. His next acts would shake the very foundations of the empire, proving that when absolute power truly becomes absolute delusion, no one and nothing is safe. The mask didn't just fall, it disintegrated into dust. By now, the whispers had turned to terrified silence, the fear had congealed into a suffocating blanket over Rome. Caligula was no longer merely slipping into madness. He was plunging headfirst, dragging the entire empire down with him into his private, perverted hell. This wasn't just a ruler. This was a social experiment gone utterly, grotesquely wrong. His conviction of being a living god wasn't a phase. It became the central, terrifying pillar of his reign. He built temples to himself, complete with priests, and demanded not just offerings, but living sacrifices in his name. The ultimate insult, the ultimate act of divine provocation, came when he ordered a colossal golden statue of himself to be placed directly in the holy temple in Jerusalem. Imagine the sheer, unbridled arrogance, the contempt for any belief system but his own twisted divinity. For Caligula, this wasn't about religious conversion. It was about absolute, total submission. He wanted to break the spirit of an entire people, to crush their sacred beliefs under the weight of his own monstrous ego. The idea sent shivers of dread not just through Judea, but across the Roman world, a sacrilege so profound, it threatened to ignite an unholy war, all for the whim of a deranged mind. And his military ambitions, they too descended into farce and horror. Instead of conquering Britannia, a true imperial prize, he marched his legions to the coast, ordered them to collect seashells as spoils of war, and declared himself victorious over the ocean. Picture thousands of battle-hardened Roman soldiers, the elite fighting force of the known world, standing bewildered on the beaches, scooping up shells. Was this a joke, a punishment, a sign of ultimate contempt for his own men and the very concept of military honor? For Caligula, the conquest wasn't about land or power. It was a bizarre, humiliating performance, a grand mockery of glory, where he, the emperor, became the only one who mattered, laughing at the absurdity he himself created. He had warped the very meaning of triumph, reducing it to a childish, yet terrifyingly real charade. But the true theater of his depravity was reserved for those closest to him, the senators, the courtiers, anyone trapped in his suffocating orbit. Forget swift, clean executions. Caligula preferred to break men's spirits before he broke their bodies. He'd force senators, men of immense dignity and lineage, to dance naked at his parties, to crawl on their knees, to perform grotesque acts for his amusement. Imagine the agonizing suspense at his lavish feasts, the forced laughter, the nervous glances, as Caligula's eyes, devoid of warmth, would roam the room, picking his next victim. One senator might be forced to praise the emperor's monstrous cruelty. Another might simply be told, mid-conversation, that his time had come, then dragged away, his half-eaten meal still on the table. This wasn't governance. It was a continuous, real-time psychological experiment. Every breath, every word, every forced smile became a gamble. His power wasn't just about life or death. It was about the absolute control over their fear, their dignity, their very will to exist. He had turned the highest echelons of Roman society into his personal puppets, dancing on the strings of his rapidly unraveling mind. This wasn't power anymore. It was performance for a mind utterly consumed by delusion, a terrifying climax of narcissism and sadism that Rome and the world had never witnessed before. The question was no longer if he would be stopped, but when and at what terrifying cost. The theatrical madness couldn't last forever. Even in a society where emperors were deified, Caligula's grotesque performance had pushed Rome to its absolute breaking point. The terror he inflicted, the humiliation he reveled in, had a chilling side effect. It forged a desperate unity among those he tormented. The very guards who once dragged screaming senators from their feasts, who stood silent witness to unspeakable acts, began to plot in secret. These weren't just disgruntled soldiers. These were men who had served Rome, who had witnessed the emperor's complete descent into depravity, and who now feared not just for their lives, but for the soul of the empire itself. The whispers began in the shadows, in hushed tones behind closed doors, first of fear, then of resistance, and finally of knives. The same crowd that had once cheered Caligula as a savior, desperate for hope, now huddled together, their hope replaced by a cold, burning resentment. They whispered of the monster, no longer just a king, but a curse that needed to be lifted. As the plots thickened around him, Caligula's own mind, already a labyrinth of delusion, began to collapse. The absolute control he craved, the terror he inflicted, became his undoing. He no longer trusted anyone. Every glance, every gesture from his closest aides, from his own family, was interpreted as a threat. The man who had reveled in breaking others was now breaking himself, consumed by the very paranoia he had cultivated in his victims. He'd pace the halls of his palace, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing hysterically, muttering to himself, no longer truly remembering the prince he once was, or the merciful mask he'd worn. The internal collapse was brutal, a terrifying echo of the external chaos he had created. And so, the stage was set not for a grand battle, but for a desperate act of liberation. The monster, having terrorized an empire and fractured his own mind, had reached the final act of his tragic play. And death, when it finally came, was less a punishment for Caligula, and more a profound, desperate relief for everyone, perhaps even for himself. The theatrical madness of Caligula had finally reached its unscheduled, violent end. On a cold January day, after a particularly humiliating theatrical performance, the monster who once controlled Rome's every breath met his fate in a dark palace corridor, ambushed by his own Praetorian guard. His death wasn't mourned. It was met with a collective, silent gasp of disbelief, then an exhale of profound, desperate relief that swept through Rome like a purifying wind. For 3 days, Rome itself held its breath, unsure if the nightmare was truly over or if another would emerge from the shadows. Caligula died, but Rome lived on. Yet something profound, something truly fundamental, broke forever that day. Before Caligula, the idea of the emperor, while powerful, still carried a veneer of divine right, of a sacred trust. There was an unspoken expectation of a ruler, however flawed, still operating within a recognizable framework of sanity. Caligula obliterated that. He didn't just abuse power, he perverted its very essence, revealing it as a terrifying, unpredictable force that could twist a man into a grotesque instrument of torture. He tore down the illusion that absolute power was benevolent or even rational. His reign left an indelible scar, a deep, festering wound on the Roman psyche. No one, from the highest senator to the lowliest citizen, could ever again truly believe in the absolute, unquestionable benevolence of a single, all-powerful ruler. The seed of paranoia, of knowing that pure, unchecked power could manifest as a depraved, unpredictable monster, was permanently sown. Future emperors, even the good ones, would always rule under the long, chilling shadow of Caligula's ghost. The system, built on the deification of its leaders, was exposed for its terrifying vulnerability. It revealed that when trauma meets unchecked authority, the consequences aren't just political. They are deeply, terrifyingly human. And that's why Caligula's story isn't just an ancient tale locked away in history books. It's a chilling, timeless warning. We live in a world of cults of personality, of cameras, of unchecked influence where leaders can rise from obscurity, promising salvation, then demanding devotion. How many leaders today, behind their polished speeches and curated images, wear a similar mask? How many are simply playing their own twisted game of control, honed not by virtue, but by a chilling understanding of human fear and desire? Caligula never truly died. He just changed masks, and the performance continues in countless forms, echoing through history. It's a show you need to understand, because the lessons from Rome's darkest hour are more relevant now than ever. If this story gave you goosebumps and made you wonder, how could someone like this ever exist? Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Let's keep exploring the hidden truths of power before history repeats itself.